Close your eyes and picture a medieval feast. A long wooden table, overflowing with roasted meats, goblets of wine and crusty bread. Maybe a jester is performing while noblemen in velvet cloaks laugh and tear into a dripping leg of lamb. But before you settle too comfortably into that scene, ask yourself this. What did ordinary people really eat in the Middle Ages? And was it delicious? Or was it as unappetizing as history sometimes suggests? The truth lies somewhere in between. Food in the Middle Ages was a daily concern, shaped by class, geography, religion, and the seasons. For some, meals were extravagant. For most, they were humble, repetitive, and carefully rationed. And yes, sometimes they were gross, at least by modern standards. But food was also central to medieval life, carrying with it deep cultural meaning, communal traditions, and even spiritual significance. Let's start with the basics. If you were a peasant, your daily diet revolved around one word: bread. Bread was the cornerstone of survival. Not soft, white bakery bread, but coarse, dense loaves made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat was rare and expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to eat soft white bread made from finely sifted flour. For everyone else, bread was brown, rough, and often mixed with ground beans, peas, or even acorns to stretch it further. Alongside bread came pottage, a thick, stew-like concoction made from grains, vegetables, and water. Think of it as medieval porridge with everything thrown in. Onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, and garlic were common additions. Spices, forget it. Salt was expensive, and pepper was a luxury. Most pottage was flavored only by what grew in the garden or the nearby hedgerow. Meat was rare for peasants. Most livestock were too valuable alive to be eaten. Cows gave milk, chickens laid eggs, pigs were raised for important occasions. So on ordinary days, meat was absent from the table. When it did appear, it was usually pork, and every part of the animal was used. Blood was turned into sausage. Organs were cooked and served, nothing was wasted. Dairy played a role, but it was unpredictable. Milk soured quickly without refrigeration, so people often turned it into cheese or butter. Eggs were more reliable, and many households kept hens for just that reason. But even these small luxuries could be threatened by disease, weather, or the whims of the local lord. Now, if you were wealthy, things looked very different. Noble households had access to an astonishing array of foods, especially during feasts. Meat was plentiful: venison, boar, beef, chicken, duck, goose, even swan or peacock if the occasion called for it. These meats were often roasted whole, seasoned with imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, or saffron, and served with elaborate sauces. Fish was another staple, especially on days when the church forbade meat. Religious fasting days occurred often, sometimes more than half the years, so nobles and peasants alike had to find creative ways to replace their meat dishes. The wealthy enjoyed fresh fish like trout or eel, or preserved fish like salted herring. In coastal regions, shellfish and oysters were consumed regularly. Fruit and vegetables were eaten, though they were often cooked rather than eaten raw. This wasn't just a matter of taste. People believed raw food was unhealthy. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums were grown in orchards. Greens like spinach, sorrel, and parsley found their way into stews and pies. And herbs were treasured not only for their flavor, but also for their supposed medicinal properties. One of the strangest and most fascinating parts of medieval dining was the way meals were served. Forget individual plates. In many homes, people shared trenchers, flat rounds of stale bread that acted like plates. After the meal, the trencher might be eaten, given to the poor, or tossed to animals. Forks were not common yet. Most people ate with knives, spoons, and their hands. Dining was a social ritual. Even peasants gathered around a shared pot. In wealthier homes, meals followed strict etiquette. Who sat where, who served whom, and what ordered dishes arrived and all carried meaning. A noble feast could have dozens of courses, each more extravagant than the last. Entertainment was common: music, performances, even live animals presented in shocking ways, like a roast pig dressed in armor, or a pie that opened to release live birds. But let's return to the question. Was medieval food gross to our modern palates? Some of it certainly would be. Preservation techniques were limited. Without refrigeration, meat was salted, smoked, or pickled. Sometimes it spoiled anyway, and people used strong spices or vinegar to mask the taste. It was drunk more often than water, not just because people liked it, but because it was safer. Water could carry disease, especially in crowded towns where waste ran freely in the streets. Insects were a constant problem. Grain stores could be infested with weevils. Bread might have bits of grit or husk in it, wearing down teeth over time. Mold was common. And sometimes, unscrupulous sellers would stretch food with questionable additives, sawdust and flour, old meat and pies. Food safety was not a concept anyone had mastered. Despite these challenges, medieval cooks were creative. They worked with what they had and created rich culinary traditions. Recipes were passed down orally or written in early cookbooks for noble households. Dishes like frumentia creamy wheat porridge, often served with meat or fruit, were beloved by rich and poor alike. Pastries, pies, and tarts were common, especially for those who could afford sugar or honey. Speaking of sugar, it was incredibly rare and expensive.
Oh, yes.
It came from the East and was considered a medicine more than a sweetener. Most desserts were made with honey or dried fruits. Candied nuts, sweet custards, and fruit preserves were considered luxury items. Peasants might enjoy a berry tart, sweetened with apples, or a simple pudding made with milk and oats. Alcohol was central to the medieval diet. Ale, mead, cider, and wine were drunk by nearly everyone, including children. These drinks were weaker than today's versions, but safer than untreated water. In monasteries, beer was brewed with great care and consumed regularly. In noble courts, wine flowed freely, sometimes spiced or warmed in winter months. Holidays and festivals were the few times peasants might feast. Harvest celebrations, Christmas or weddings, were excuses to roast a pig, bake sweetbreads, or open the cellar for stored cider. These moments were cherished, remembered, and sometimes exaggerated in songs and stories. For most people, these rare meals stood in stark contrast to the monotony of their daily gruel. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was power. What you ate said everything about your place in the world. Laws even existed to control this. Sumptuary laws told people what they could or couldn't eat based on their class. A commoner caught eating venison or wearing a noble's colors could be fined or punished. The gap between peasant and noble wasn't just seen, it was tasted at every meal. So was medieval food gross? It depends on who you ask. It was often bland, sometimes spoiled and shaped entirely by what the land and season provided. But it was also inventive, hearty, and meaningful. People knew how to stretch what little they had. They learned how to preserve, how to cook with love, and how to feed a family through long winters. In some ways, their food was more honest than ours. It came straight from the ground, the barn, or the forest. There were no factories, no chemicals, no processed ingredients, just bread, broth, and the skill of hands that had cooked the same meals for generations. The next time you sit down to a meal, remember that, not so long ago, a bowl of hot pottage, a crust of bread, and a cup of weak ale could mean the difference between life and starvation. It may not sound like fine dining, but for a medieval villager, it was survival and, maybe, if the herbs were fresh and the weather was kind, even a small delight. So now that you've taken a bite out of medieval history, one thing is clear: life at the table back then was anything but ordinary. From thick pottage bubbling in a soot-stained pot to trenchers soaked with grease and mystery meat, food in the Middle Ages was an experience shaped by hardship, creativity, and class. For peasants, every crumb counted. For nobles, a feast was a performance. And between those extremes were people just trying to fill their bellies and make it through another long winter. Sure, some dishes might seem unappetizing today. Imagine sipping warm ale before breakfast or gnawing on salted fish for the 4th time that week. But food was also a source of pride, community, and even joy. Every harvest, every festival, every rare roast was a celebration of survival. If this journey through medieval kitchens, fields, and feasting halls has made you look at your dinner plate a little differently, then you've tasted what life was really like in another time. So go ahead, appreciate your next meal, no matter how simple, because for most people in the Middle Ages, even a slice of bread and a bowl of broth could feel like a blessing. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.